Lowell's family had immigrated from Germany. His parents actually grew up just outside of Quasqueton. His mother was Anna Klotz. That photo in the center here is actually an ancient photo, an old photo, archived photo of Anna's family farm. She grew up almost across the street from Lowell's father, Christian Walter. And after they got married, they had several children. Lowell was the youngest. The photo on the left here shows Lowell when he graduated from school here in 1913. He saved money and ultimately ended up moving to Des Moines to go to college. Later in his life, this photo is from the 1980s, and it actually hangs in the house and here at the Visitor Center for the property. Agnes Nielsen was born in Bradgate, Iowa. It's a small town in north central Iowa near Humboldt. That would be kind of the closest larger town near Bradgate. Her family, she was from a family of Danish immigrants, and one of the younger children in her family, I think there were 8 or 10 children in her family. And she graduated from school there and had ambitions to attend college as well, which was kind of unusual in 1913, 1912. The photo in the center shows her actually working at an office that they later ended up purchasing the business for. So Lowell and Agnes met each other in Des Moines while attending the Four Seas Business School. So Des Moines, the capital of Iowa, was a relatively large city, even then, compared to where Lowell grew up in Quasqueton and where Agnes grew up in Bradgate near Humboldt. So they attended the school there from 1913, graduating in 1917. Living in Des Moines at the time, they became engaged, and here we have their wedding photo. Lowell and Agnes, very young as they started their life together. Their first home that they purchased was a relatively modest home. It was in Des Moines. It was a newer constructed home, but relatively basic, 2 bedrooms to it. By the 1940s, they had moved to another area in Des Moines and a slightly larger home, but really nothing very ostentatious for them. In the 1940 census, Agnes's mother, who was widowed, had resided or registered her residence as their home also, staying with Lowell and Agnes in Des Moines. So the Walters, during their time together, really enjoyed having an opportunity to visit different art sites, museums, travel, and they became interested in Frank Lloyd Wright and his architecture. They traveled quite a bit and actually ended up traveling to Tokyo in Japan and stayed in the Imperial Hotel there. The photo on the right here is one that Agnes, a snapshot that she took from their room in the Imperial Hotel when they were staying there. They together purchased an existing business around 1917 when they graduated from college, the Iowa Road Building Company. Lowell was the general manager of the business. Agnes worked in the office, organizing everything they were doing. They had a patent for what they called bituminous oil, which is a heated sealant that they would put on gravel roads. In Iowa and Midwestern states in the early 1900s, many of the roads were gravel and automobiles were becoming quite popular. So they were definitely in demand to travel around Iowa and surrounding states, putting this heated sealant down on the roads. On the lower left here, we have a photo of their business, which is, it could have been found on Keosauqua Way in Des Moines. When they initially purchased the business, they had a horse-drawn carriage and they'd have a gentleman ride on the back and they would put this heated sealant down on the roads. Later though, they updated to automobiles like you see in the photo on the left. Lowell was pretty interested in keeping his employees busy year-round. It wasn't always appropriate to apply that sealant to the roads during other times of the year when it was colder. So he would have his employees do things like sell knife sets, baskets. Lowell also was very entrepreneurial. So he actually owned patents on a few different things. Shown on the right here is a small scooter that Lowell and Agnes, well, that Lowell had a patent on. You'd stand, there are two boards there, and you'd kind of paddle the scooter to get it to propel forward. With the road building business, they also had, they would take the profits from that business and they would reinvest that into purchasing farmland. They came back to Buchanan County near Quasqueton, where Lowell was originally from, and initially just started purchasing farmland from basically family members of the Walters. Really kind of as they were in the 20s and the 30s, they were in a position at that time that they couldn't actually afford, some of their family members couldn't afford to maintain and keep their farms. So the Walters ended up purchasing that farmland. This photo here on the top is actually one of Lowell's brothers in an early tractor here in the area. But over the years, they accumulated just over 5,000 acres of farmland, which was like 18 to 20 different farms. Lowell and Agnes were still living in Des Moines at the time, so they'd travel back and forth to manage the farms. They would work with the farmers and renters and encourage them to plant certain types of plants in the farmlands themselves, or how they were going to manage raising livestock if that's what they were doing at that particular farm. And even today, that's like almost a 2.5-hour drive. That's without gravel roads like they had to kind of encounter at that time. So they were really interested in creating kind of a retirement estate here in the area. So at the time that they were purchasing farmland, Lowell bought an acre from his uncle, a couple more acres from another family friend, to start creating the property here at Cedar Rock. So here on the lower right, we have Lowell with his farmland manager, his initial farmland manager, which was Fred Frank, a relative of the Walters. So Fred would manage some of the day-to-day business of the farm management business, but then defer to Lowell. So as you can see here, now we have some photos of the Cedar Rock property. So Lowell and Agnes began to acquire property here in the 1940s. Quasqueton, which is not quite a mile from this area along the river that flows this rock is the Wapsipian, another Native American word. The locals, we call it the Wapsi. But the area in Quasqueton was settled around 1842. Early in its time, settlers would come out here and recreate. They'd meet on the rock. There's land here on the other side. They could picnic. They'd enter the water and they'd go swimming as well. The postcard on the right is from the early 1900s. So the area was pretty locally known and called Cedar Rock, which is how the house here ultimately became Cedar Rock. So the Walters, by 1945, had accumulated about 11 acres here on the site, and they were interested in commissioning an architect for the property that they thought was, kind of the bee's knees. So Lowell writes this letter that you see here to Frank Lloyd Wright in January of 1945. Lowell's correspondence with Wright was often pretty particular, pretty wordy, pretty involved. My favorite line here is at the bottom. It says, regarding cost, I would like something quite nice, but of course not too extravagant. So the Walters were familiar with Wright and his work, and also his tendency to overshoot budgets. They talked about including snapshots of the property. These two items here actually are some drawings that Lowell created of what he thought might be interesting as far as a home for the property that he furnished to Taliesin. There was concern at that time that it may be difficult to acquire building materials, especially during wartime. So they were realistic in thinking that this project might take some time to come to reality, but I don't think that they planned on 5 years before they could move into their house. Lloyd Wright was incredibly busy at this time, but responded to the Walters immediately. By February 3rd, he had written this letter to the Walters, very short, very succinct, as much of Wright's correspondence back to the Walters was. We'll design a dwelling for you, send further details. There'll be no basement nor attic. Mr. Wright's business did not mention that the Walters were not going to get a garage. Lowell was a big fan of those and requested that in several of their different letters over time, and even suggestions after they had plans for the house, but it just wasn't really in the cards for this type of design. Lloyd Wright would often highlight some of his work in different magazines at the time. And typically, when you think of a couple commissioning Frank Lloyd Wright to do a home, we often hear stories about they'd get, topographical maps of the site. Wright would ask for what their requests were for the property, and he would design something according to their requests and suit it to the site. Cedar Rock is a little unusual in that respect because the Walters were looking at different designs of Wright's and different things that they needed for the property, but they came across this copy of the Ladies' Home Journal in June of 1945. Frank Lloyd Wright had already designed this home. He was using it in some exhibitions at the time, and it was a crystal house for town and country. But it had these beautiful windowed walls and then kind of a central living space with your evening kind of bedroom space off to the side, a carport, and then additional space if needed for, a maid or some sort of staff. They even had a model created of the property that traveled to the Museum of Modern Art in 1945. So Frank Lloyd Wright was really interested in this style of house, and the Walters saw this and became equally interested. They thought it would suit their site well and also their plans. They liked to entertain, and it definitely had space to do something like that. So that's the design that they requested from Frank Lloyd Wright. The property ended up containing more than just that. A formal entrance gate, as you can see here, the plans for the gate. It has these large metal gates on it, and then a large Bedford stone planter engraved on the front with the family name. The road here in front of the park was gravel until about 1980. So approaching a large brick gate like this, I think you'd really get a feeling that you were, definitely entering someone's exclusive estate. The design process for the house was complete. So it included interior designs for furnishings and also exterior discussions about plantings near the house. And even you can see these grapevine leaves on the top of the house. The drawings for the house, I think, are really quite stunning. You can even see the light as it penetrates the house. There's skylights in the garden room, and then also an additional skylight in the kitchen for the home. The furnishings for the house are also designed specific for the site, which was often the case with the Usonian. Frank Lloyd Wright specified the wood for the home would be walnuts, and they actually have cushions on their furniture that could be described as comfortable, which is a little unusual for a Wright site. The home also includes a river pavilion or a boathouse. The Walters really enjoyed entertaining and spending time hunting and fishing along the river and the Wapsipinicon River corridor. Frank Lloyd Wright did not design many river pavilions that were actually executed over his career. There were only about 5. Cedar Rock is the only one we know of that has a dedicated living space. So the ramp for the boat drops right into the Wapsipinicon River. You would store your boat here underneath the boathouse. The upper portion has a terrace and then an indoor space that you could use almost like a small studio apartment. So it's 2-story, and Wright had them cantilever it right off that existing rock that we saw in the early photos of the property. The Walters were really interested in utilizing this space, and I think not necessarily aware how long it was going to take to complete this home. It took 2 years. There's a lot of concrete. It was kind of a special build, especially for the area here. So Lowell in 1946 had a 2-room cabin and a garage constructed on the property. Here he is with his Packard and his trusty hunting dog, enjoying that space. So this was not designed by Wright initially, but after the home was finished in 1950, Frank Lloyd Wright created alterations for this property. A wooden screen that goes in front of it. They actually moved the cabin and turned it, and the garage as well. Then Wright designed kind of a pagoda style roof for the structure, linking the two structures, and then some masonry, a pillar near it. This portion of the property is currently undergoing some restoration in a partnership through the Friends of Cedar Rock, one of our nonprofit support groups, and then a local community college. The Walters were not able to break ground here, even though they contacted Frank Lloyd Wright in 1945, until they had secured building materials and a contractor who was able to handle this style of construction. They ended up going back to Des Moines and working with Cacharo Construction. At the time, they would do large scale buildings, movie theaters, different things like that. So here are construction photos of the property. So the home is built primarily with brick, glass, and concrete. So they used a lot of wooden forms to hold up the structure as they were doing things like pouring concrete. You can even see here on the roof, this collection of people. We believe this is the contractor. Here's Frank Lloyd Wright standing on the roof of the house, and then Lowell Walter, the homeowner here. But you can see a little bit of the site as well. It had been pastured prior to the Walters acquiring it. So there was a lot of openness from that side of the home. And then from the garden room, which is here, the main house, you would see the river itself and then the boathouse that they were also constructing. So it did take about 2 years to complete this home. Frank Lloyd Wright, one of his students, was the on-site fellow for this home. That was John de Covenhill. He would rent a room in Quaski or Quasqueton and stay there during the week. And then he would come to Cedar Rock Monday through Friday and make sure things were done in kind of the right way for the property. When the Walters had completed construction of the home, there was a lot of interest in the house, a lot of newspaper articles, magazine coverage of the property. And they said, well, you know, it's a private home now. We'd like to really enjoy it. So they posted some information in the paper and they said, we're going to open our home for 2 Saturdays. And anyone who's interested in coming out and touring will charge 50 cents for the adults and 25 cents for the kids. And it was packed. They had more people than they knew what to do with. Over 4,000 people visited the Walter house in those 2 Saturdays. Lowell was also very connected to the community of Quasqueton. So he and Agnes donated the money that they earned from that, those 2 afternoons, to the city of Quasqueton, who ended up purchasing Veterans Park with that. Today, that park itself is now a campground for the city of Quasqueton and not far from the house itself. This photo was taken for a newspaper who was doing a story on the Walters, and Agnes had written a letter to her sister shortly after this photo was taken and enclosed the photo for her, but talks about how she had been cleaning and she was a little not as fresh as she would have liked to have been when the newspaper came. And she says they wanted us to look like we were just lounging on the patio, and here I am perspiring and, you know, had just finished cleaning this house, which 1,800 square feet. I just wasn't as fresh as I wanted to be. And there's lots of fun stories that we get from letters that the Walters wrote to family members or family members that are local that tell us about their time in the home. So it's one of the neat aspects of the property here that we get to retain. After the open house here at the property, that would have been in July of 1950. So by August 24th of 1950, Lowell had invited Frank Lloyd Wright and his architectural students to visit Cedar Rock. So in their annual migration from Taliesin to Taliesin West, Frank Lloyd Wright's students pulled up here at Cedar Rock. We have photos of their little Crosley cars at the house, and enjoyed roasted leg of lamb here at the council fire. Here's Wright, Olgavana, Agnes, and Lowell, and then families and students of the fellowship, along with guests Lord and Lady Pentland, who were traveling with the Wrights. This visit also included kind of an inspection, if you would like to call it that, or a walkthrough by Frank Lloyd Wright, the property. There in the upper left, you see Frank Lloyd Wright. They're standing at the boathouse here on the property. This is John de Covenhill watching as Frank Lloyd Wright uses his cane, as he often would, to point something out on the property. I would imagine they're looking at, we have a cedar tree that grows off the council fire in this area here. Lowell with his pipe studying Frank Lloyd Wright's discussion. Another photo from that day taken inside the home. Lowell is sitting near the dining room table here, speaking with Frank Lloyd Wright about a magazine that highlighted the Walter House. Walters enjoyed the property from 1950 until 1981. At that point, Lowell passed away, and Agnes wasn't too interested in spending time here on her own. So she went ahead with their plans. In the 70s, they had sold the farmland in one land transaction. That's 5,000 acres of land, and just retained the 11 acres here at the house. So she donated the 11 acre estate here, the house and its contents, to the state of Iowa for public use. So here's Agnes at that time with Iowa Governor Robert Ray. Larry Wilson was the director of the Iowa Conservation Commission at that time. Later, the Iowa Conservation Commission turned into the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, which is where I work and what manages the site now. Louis Beecher and Paul Ehlers were the lawyer and the banker for the Walter Charitable Trust that the Walters created. So becoming a state park, Cedar Rock, as I said, was donated to the state of Iowa and the Iowa Conservation Commission. In the 80s, that became the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. They just initially donated the 11 acres in this portion here, which included the boathouse, the house, property around the house, and then an easement from the formal entrance gate here to access the property. Since then, the park, between state purchases and Walter Charitable Trust purchases, has grown to about 426 acres. So we maintain about 5 miles of trails throughout the park for hiking and walking, and also about 5 miles along the Wapsipinicon River in watershed. We also are working currently on maintaining a lot of this property for habitat and different things throughout the space to, best protect the land itself. There was an oxbow in this area along the river that water would back up into and flood. We're currently in the process of digging this oxbow out and making kind of a flood mitigation area and a permanent wetland that'll be in this portion of the property. We still work on ways to enhance the property itself, especially considering, for natural resource use. We also have a lot of wetland, woodland, different prairies. This area near the visitor center had been used for agricultural purposes until about 3 years ago. And we planted it in a 4-britch prairie. It's been really interesting to see kind of the transition of the property since then and the different animals that are utilizing this area of the property as well. There's still some tillable farmland in this section here that is part of the park as well. The Walter Charitable Trust rents that out and uses it as a form of income. But all in all, the 426 acres that make Cedar Rock make this one of the largest tracts of public land in Buchanan County, where the park is located. So portions of it can be used for hunting. Anything along the river can be used for fishing. People come out here and mushroom. Lots of different activities throughout the park. The park itself is maintained by one full-time staff, that's myself. In some years, depending on what we have for budget, we've had as few as 2 seasonal staff. We maintain the 426 acres as well as the house, and then offer tours to visitors when they come through as well during our season. The last couple of years, we've been very lucky to have about 6 seasonal staff. So we've been very fortunate in the last few years to be able to have a lot of opportunity to do restoration projects and manage the natural resources of the site with the amount of staff that we've had. We also have about 30 different volunteers that come out to the park, and they donate their time and their talents. Last just under hours of volunteer time at the site. We also have the Walter Charitable Trust Fund. Initially, that was the single funding source for the site. Most state parks in Iowa, which Cedar Rock is a part of, are funded through general fund dollars, with some funding coming from different gaming and like lottery ticket sales, that kind of thing. And then what they create in like camping fees and day use fees, those types of funds are what are used to manage parks. But Cedar Rock is a little unusual. We're free. A tour here does not actually cost anything. So the homeowners had created the Walter Charitable Trust Fund, and this trust was initially about $1 million to maintain and care for the site. Now, the trust did some really amazing restorations at the property when they first were established after the Walters donated the home to the public. And they, for many years, until about 2009, also purchased land for the park. They funded the purchasing of the property where the visitor center is located here, paid for the infrastructure, and even the visitor center building, which is where I am now, as well as a shop, sewer system, all sorts of things up here. But around 2009, the trust was in a position where they had a lot of land, had a lot of investments, but didn't necessarily have a lot of income to continue to manage the site like they had in the past. So at that point, Cedar Rock rolled over onto state park funding, which was also pretty tight. For a few years there, it was just one full-time staff and then 2 seasonals. But since then, as I've said, we've been fortunate to grow that. So we also have the Friends of Cedar Rock. They're a nonprofit support group whose goals are working for preservation, restoration, and promotion of the sites. They've been amazing for us, helping us create long-term goals for the site and fundraising specific items for preservation and restoration on the house. They've restored the house fountain, the River Pavilion project, restoration project, which we'll talk about here in a couple minutes. They also are the partners with the community college in working on the restoration of the Green Cabin here. And they're in the planning stages for a new restoration project, which will be their biggest yet for the site. They also sponsor and volunteer at our special events. Each year we have an evening event, the Strawberry Moon, and it's a great opportunity to meet the Friends of Cedar Rock as they're here on site. They also host an annual lecture symposium. They call an afternoon with Frank Lloyd Wright. Typically speakers speak on a Frank Lloyd Wright site or topic, and then something that would be similar along with that. They also record those, and over the years, they've interviewed some of the other Iowa homeowners, and it's a great opportunity to archive some of that information too, which is pretty neat. One of the things they've started working with the last few years is a concert series inside the home using the Steinway piano that's part of the property and the marimba that the Walters had as well. They also manage a website, their own website, and social media for the site. They fund targeted advertising for like the Iowa Public Radio, and help with promotions to promote the house as well. A little bit of different restoration projects that had to be kind of taken on at the site. And, you know, it's not a Wright house unless it leaks. Cedar Rock was no exception to that rule. The house itself, initially, the roof for the home was kind of ballast or gravel, but when the state took over in 1981, there were plenty of ways for water to get in. So in the late 1980s, after much planning and discussion, a multi-year project came on that the Walter Charitable Trust funded because the Friends of Cedar Rock did not exist yet. So they took the roofing material, took it down to the bare concrete, made repairs to it, prepared it for applying an EPDM, kind of a rubber bladder, to the roof itself. There was existing copper edging on the clear story level on the roof of the house. They raised the skylights, which initially sat right on the deck for the house, and then added that rubber bladder to the roof. There's also a copper edge along the lower portion of the roof that needed to be added for that project as well. That was like a $120,000 project for the site. There was some grant money involved in that, but largely it was funded by the Walter Charitable Trust. Other items needed repair in the property, like the overhang here at the boathouse roof. The concrete needed to be redone as well. Another project was burying gas lines and natural gas and electric lines to the house itself. This was done just about the same time as the roofing project. The entrance gate and the council fire, and some of the masonry around the home needed a lot of attention as well. Some of those areas had been rebuilt. But you can see even Frank Lloyd Wright's attention to detail in many of his designs, and that was reproduced. In the house itself, the skylights in the house, and then the clear story windows, we get a lot of water that would sit on the roof. So the wood around those was deteriorating, leaving an opportunity to enter the house. So at that time, those windows, which had been single pane glass, were replaced with a double pane glass. More recently, in 2015, we have a natural gas line that comes to the site from about 3/4 of a mile away. And there was a coupling that failed in this natural gas line. And we needed to replace 3/4 of a mile of natural gas line to be able to heat the property here. So they bored line through the farm field and prairie near the park to bring it up to the house. This is in the roadway to the boathouse where there's couplings that bring it natural gas up to the house, to the visitor center, and then down to the boathouse. So that was an interesting project. And it was November when these photos were taken, but it was a very cold year. We had additional heaters in the house to keep the radiant heat or the gravitational heat so it wouldn't freeze, and the plants inside the house. And it was a very cold winter. I think it was 31 degrees in the master bedroom, like 2 days before the natural gas got turned back on. So that was an interesting project. One of our most recent projects, though, was restoration of the boathouse that's here. So the river pavilion, some of these walls had been redone about the time, kind of the late 80s, but we're in need of that again. The river is flooded here in this photo. Typically, this is grass around this tree, but repeated flooding happens along the Wapsipinicon River and for the boathouse, not the house, but the boathouse. And a lot of repairs needed done on this portion of the property. So the Friends of Cedar Rock the Walter Charitable Trust and the Iowa DNR worked together to fund this. It was just about $200,000 restoration of the boathouse area. So they removed a lot of the concrete from the terrace, the foot walls around the house, rebuilt those, refashioned the terrace itself. They made changes in this area. The retaining wall had been put back in a style that wasn't historically accurate. But when Wright designed this, initially there was a tree that grew out of the ground here, and he designed the wall to go jog right around it. So this is more that initial style. The Friends of Cedar Rock, led by Allison York, and the Iowa DNR at the time, led by Chuck Gipp, even Frank Lloyd Wright, enjoying a ribbon cutting for that particular restoration project here at the site. But the boathouse is really most people's one of their favorite parts of the property. So being able to have a restoration of that was really important for the site. So now we'll do kind of a short photographic tour of the property. The home has a signature tile, as you can see here. There are 10 homes or structures by Frank Lloyd Wright in Iowa, but Cedar Rock is the only signed structure. So here you can see the walkway towards the entrance of the house. This photo was taken under the carport. As you enter the house, that darkness, that compression that is common in a Frank Lloyd Wright structure is really obvious here in the entryway. There's a coat closet on the left, and then a glass display here on the right. In masonry for the house, there are openings that are backlit, that pieces of colored glass are placed in. There are 3 of these on the interior of the house, and then a couple spots for it on the exterior as well, as a telephone table in the entryway. The garden room for the home is really an amazing space. The house opens up, it expands, and light is just all around you, coming from the sides, the windows, the walls, everywhere, even the ceiling. The house itself has a garden, as you can see here. There's actually soil in this section of the house, and this pothos grows almost 60 feet around the clear story level, but all rooted in this area in the garden room. You can just get a peek of the Wapsipinicon River. It meanders past, so you can see it from this side of the house as it goes this direction here. The details of the house, the furnishings, there was a major reproduction of the fabrics for the house, also funded by the Walter Charitable Trust, but much like you saw in that original photo in 1950 with Frank Lloyd Wright and Lowell. So this is kind of the second generation of fabric for the property. A lot of continuity with the design and colors and textures as well. A view of the fireplace and the piano, a Steinway over here. The Walters like to entertain, and this room was really perfect for that. The dining area, the chairs are plywood veneered with a walnut finish. The dining table is built in, but movable. This portion of the buffet can be used. You can pull it out and butt it together with the table itself. So multi-use in that area of the house. The kitchen here, the cabinetry, again, plywood veneered with a walnut finish, open shelves, common for a Wright site. The stove is original, what was selected for the property when the Walters moved in. They did have a dishwasher, but it had a cabinet front and was top loading. This dishwasher was replaced by the Walters in the 70s. So to access the other portions of the house, the restrooms, the bedrooms, there's 50 feet of cabinetry and library shelves down a somewhat dark and compressed hallway. This is the master bath for the house. Our bathrooms are unique at Cedar Rock. We have 3 of these. The bathrooms, actually, the sink pivots from on top of the toilet to on top of the tub, and you lift the lid here for the toilet. It's very cozy, but a nice a nice way to enjoy your cabin type home, I suppose. Master bedroom here, the largest of the bedrooms. You can see the clear story windows up above. You know, when you come to Cedar Rock and visit the site, it's almost like the Walters just stepped out of the home. Their clothes still in the closet, Lowell's pipe here on the table. It's really neat to kind of, it's almost like they just went out to lunch and you get an opportunity to go through their house. We enjoy that aspect of the property. The exterior of the house, standing near the garden room here, you can see the patio. Agnes was photographed on many years prior to this, a cutting garden here, but you really get a view at the length of the house and the size of this concrete roof, which is really impressive. Here you'd walk past the garden room on your way down to the river. You can see the cantilevers on the roof and the grapevines that grow on top of the roof. Another look at the house itself with these large overhangs, the masonry, and those grapevines as well. The house is actually designed with a roof that could hold a garden. It's engineered to do that, but the Walters never executed that portion of the design. The boathouse, taken from a view above the river, shows you how it's cantilevered off the Cedar Rock area of the property. You could store your boat in here, terrace, and access the boathouse itself. What an amazing spot to spend an afternoon on the Wapsipinicon River. The interior of the boathouse has a small bed. Lowell would do a lot of his farm management business here at the desk. There's a phone here as well. And a small bathroom and kitchenette are also located in behind this area, well, behind the fireplace here. And then access to the patio where it's screened in to keep you safe from those mosquitoes as well. So what's next for Cedar Rock? We just, like last month, completed the historic structure report for the property, which is a plan for preservation for the sites. We do tours of the sites. We've offered some social distancing options, and then we collaborate with different entities to keep Cedar Rock relevant and in the news. There's a Chinese author who's creating a book and translating a lot of Wright's information into Chinese. We also do concerts, as you can see here. In Iowa, there are additional sites to see, not just Cedar Rock, that are open to the public. The hotel in Mason City you can visit and stay in, as well as the Stockman House and some other amazing architecture by Prairie Style architects there to see as well. And then there are several privately owned residences by Wright in Iowa. The Miller House in Charles City, which is undergoing restoration. The Trier House in Johnston, which is lovingly cared for. The Meyer House in Monona, a couple from Chicago purchased that and have been doing amazing restoration work on that. The Sunday House in Marshalltown, also purchased by a couple from Chicago, who did amazing work finishing the right things in that house that had not fully been executed. The Alsop House in Oskaloosa and the Lamberson House in Oskaloosa. The Lamberson House will be open for a tour later this spring, I believe. And then the Grant Residence in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So if you're in the area at some point or planning a trip to Iowa, Cedar Rock is located in the northeast section, not too far from the Stockman House in Mason City. So if you want to drive directly to Cedar Rock, we're 4 hours from Chicago and then a couple hours to Mason City where you could stay, or not too far from Taliesin if you were going to visit there as well. These photos are from our evening event, Strawberry Moon, and some information on the different events we have here at the site. If you're interested in further information on the house, the Friends of Cedar Rock have a Facebook page and a website you're welcome to visit. I guess at this point, do you guys have questions for me?
There are some questions. There definitely are some questions. I am working on setting up something for Stockman House, so watch out for that on the JCC website, hopefully coming soon. Susan had a question. How is a home like this with all the windows kept warm in the winter and cooled in the summer in the 1940s?
Excellent question. Yes. Initially, all the glass in this home was single pane glass. So the Walters primarily used it as a 3-season house. They were basically here from planting. Maybe they could squeak in a Christmas, even if they could access the house with the long lane. That was a challenge in the snow. We have the initial gravitational heating system here. The upper ceiling or upper windows have been replaced with a double pane glass, but we have these pressure fitted window covers that we use over the windows in the winter to keep that garden going, which is partially why we have the tour season that we do. So in its current state, it's not a year-long home you would want to live in.
Makes sense. This house looks a little bit more comfortable than other of the Frank Lloyd Wright homes. Would you agree with that?
That
And
is
why do you think it is?
Yeah, that is a comment we hear a lot from our visitors. I would not describe Frank Lloyd Wright as creating something that feels homey, but there's something about Cedar Rock. And you know, when you consider it's glass, it's concrete, and it's masonry, these hard building materials, I would classify it as a homey structure by Frank Lloyd Wright, and I think a lot of our visitors do too. So come experience it sometime if you can. It's really a homey place.
What was if I missed it, I apologize. What was the budget for the house? And frankly, these houses tend to come in over budget. So
Absolutely. Yes. Excellent question. And I don't think I mentioned that. So your average home of this size in 1950 was like $5,000 to $7,000. Well, the Walters were working with Wright, so they budgeted 25,000 and then 50,000. And then they ended up spending more like 120 or 150,000 on this property at that time. So well over budget.
yeah, well over budget. And it sounds like it's also maybe one of the most expensive Wright houses that's been built.
It is probably very expensive. I don't know that it's one of the most, but yeah.
Vicky's asking about the maid's quarters and the carport. Could you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, you can see that in this photo here. The light is actually on in the maid's quarters. Now, the Walters never had a maid or hired staff. Agnes did the bulk of the cleaning here. They never had children either, but a few nieces and some nephews would help out around the house. They had a groundskeeper though. He didn't live on site. But the house itself, 150 feet long from head to tail. The carport separates the maid's quarters from the main portion of the house. It's a full bedroom and a full bath in the maid's quarters and a small closet with its own phone. So if you would have been hired help for the Walters, you would have had a very beautiful place to stay for sure.
You know, you said they didn't have children, and I feel like many of the people who built Frank Lloyd Wright homes didn't have children. It seems like a common theme, and I'm wondering if it is because his houses are not necessarily all that homey.
Or child friendly. I think of like the Avery Coonley house when I think of homes with children, you know, and or even Hollyhock House in California, where Wright would cater to the children if there were some, you know, like what is her Sugar Top, having her own bedroom that was, you know, designed to her scale, which would have worked for a short time. But yeah, it does seem to be a common theme.
We have a question from London, so I'm really excited about that. Neil, thank you for joining us. Neil would like to know what the current value of the house would be.
Yes. So as part of the state park system in Iowa, we don't really have a current value on the house. If you were to just build something like this from scratch without kind of the Frank Lloyd Wright connection, but to build it would cost around just over $1 million today, the entire estate.
Does that include the land or just the house?
That would just be the house, yeah.
Because it's on a nice piece of property, so.
An amazing piece of property, yeah. Yeah, and I think what the average cost per acre in Iowa right now It's not necessarily like hunting ground or farm ground, is about 5,000 an acre.
What is your favorite part of the house? Do you have one?
I have a few spots. There is something really magical about the garden room. And the light that comes in it, and even having worked here, I've been here since 2005, and you can see people come in and they come in that garden room and they're, who knows what they traveled here with, people honking at them or their air conditioner broke or what's going on with their life. But there's something really rejuvenating for people when they're in the garden room. It's just, you stand taller, a weight is lifted. Wright really achieved an amazing thing bringing the outdoors in the garden room space in this house. But the boathouse is also really amazing.
Katie, how did you come to be in this position and learn so much about Frank Lloyd Wright or this particular house?
Yeah, I'm local. I grew up in Independence, which is the city closest to Quasqueton and Cedar Rock. I was studying to learn about natural resources. I wanted to work with the Department of Natural Resources or interpretation in environmental education, and became a seasonal here. And there's something kind of addictive about Frank Lloyd Wright's work. When I started here, I'd just seen this house, but over the years, I've been to all of his personal homes and about 45 of his private and public homes designed by Wright across the country. I have not been to Falling Water yet, but it's on my list. But the Dana Thomas house is one of my favorites.
You can go to our YouTube page, JCC Chicago YouTube page, and you can see our tour of Falling Water. We had a tour of Falling Water. We have one last question from Vicky. She said, can you please tell us more about the Pullman bathrooms? Did Frank Lloyd Wright design them?
I will go back to that photo of the bathroom. Frank Lloyd Wright did not design that. These rooms were made by a company. They're a subsidiary of the Pullman Rail Company. John de Covenhill, who was Wright's on-site fellow, his family had some ties to that business. So I'm not sure if that was their in here. But Wright appreciated them because of their compact and efficient use of space. And so this home got 3. The plumber who worked on the site was local, and he wrote a letter to his union and said, we cannot have this because there's just 3 hookups under the toilet and then under the tub itself. If you're interested and you email me, I actually have the ad for this unit too, which is pretty cool. So I can't say we're the only site that has them, but we're the only site I know of that has them. So
not the most luxurious bathroom, but I guess they spent $100,000 on the house.
Right.
Yeah, they had to pick and choose where they were going to spend their money, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, Katie, thank you so much. I'm really glad that we were able to reschedule this and that the technology worked out this time. So thank you for your patience and getting back with us and sharing this program with us. Let's see, what else do we?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Of course. Coming up on Thursday, we have a tour of, we have the DeRote Tapestry Tour. You can visit our website for that, for more information. And then next week, we've got an author discussion, and we are going to visit Frank Lloyd Wright's Lawrence House on Tuesday. So all that information is available on our website, jccchicago.org. Again, thank you, everyone. Take care and be well.